grand ceremony was a spectacle, a breathtaking event fit for royalty. The expansive estate of Ravensford Castle was bathed in golden sunlight as the nobles of the kingdom gathered to witness the union of two powerful families. The air was filled with the scent of roses and fresh linens, the sound of whispered conversations and the clinking of fine glasses. The perfect occasion, they thought. A marriage that would elevate the Duke of Ravensford's standing and secure the Larkspur family's place in the heart of the kingdom. But for Isabella Larkspur, standing at the altar with her heart pounding beneath the weight of the white gown she wore, it was anything but perfect. The long train of her dress flowed behind her, but it felt more like a shackle than an elegant statement. Every delicate stitch in the fabric, every pearl embedded into the lace, was a reminder of a life she never chose. She had been raised for this moment, her marriage to Duke Alistair Warwick, a man who had never seen her as anything more than a means to an end. It was not a marriage of love but of necessity, a contract sealed with her family's ambition and his desire to cement his power. There was no romance here, no fire, no passion. Only duty. Alistair Warwick, standing at the altar beside her, looked every inch the Duke, tall, regal, with dark hair combed back from his angular face. His eyes were cold, calculating as they swept over the guests in the hall. His gaze lingered just for a moment on the back of the room. That was when Isabella saw her, Sophia Dunsmore, the woman who had long held Alistair's affections, standing at the far end of the hall. She was beautiful, effortlessly so, in a gown of deep crimson that accentuated her figure. The Duke had brought her here to their wedding, his mistress. Isabella's breath caught in her throat as their eyes met, the briefest moment of shared understanding passing between them. Sophia, poised and calm, gave her no smile, no sneer. She simply looked at Isabella as if she were witnessing something she had seen 1,000 times before. Isabella's pulse quickened, her hand trembling where it rested on the bouquet. This wedding, her wedding, had become a mockery of everything she had once believed in. The ceremony proceeded as expected. The officiant, a tired old man with a croaky voice, recited the vows, his words falling like stones into the silence of the room. Isabella didn't hear him. She could only hear the thudding of her own heart, each beat a reminder of the life she was being forced into. Alistair stood beside her, impassive, as if this was just another business transaction. He spoke his vows with a cool indifference that sent a chill through her spine. I, Alistair Warwick, Duke of Ravensford, take thee, Isabella Larkspur, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do us part. His voice was steady, but there was no warmth in it, no affection. He hadn't even glanced at her when he spoke those words. It was a formality, a necessary step. Isabella barely heard her own voice when it was her turn to say her vows. She spoke the words by rote, her eyes fixed on the ground before her. The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The rings were exchanged, and the Duke placed the heavy gold band on her finger. She felt the cold weight of it, a symbol of the life she had been trapped into. A chain, but then something in her broke, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Her hand, which had been trembling slightly at her side, now shook with purpose. Without a word, she reached up and removed the wedding ring from her finger. The Duke's eyes flickered toward her, a flash of confusion crossing his face before he masked it with his usual cool demeanor. Isabella, however, did not look at him. Her eyes were on Sophia, still standing at the back of the room. Isabella placed the ring carefully on the velvet cushion held out by the officiant. The silence in the room was palpable. A collective breath held, her voice, steady but cold, rang out across the hall. Then he's yours. Words hung in the air, a declaration of freedom, a final severing of the ties that bound her to this man, to this life. She felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a heavy cloak. Alistair's face went pale, his jaw tightening, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. Sophia's lips curled into a smile, one of victory, though it was a quiet one. She had always known this moment would come. In the back of her mind, she had always known that Isabella was merely a placeholder. The Duke had never truly belonged to her. Isabella's heart, despite its rage and sorrow, was finally at peace. She had done it. She had broken free from the expectations that had shackled her for so long. She turned her back on the altar, on Alistair, and walked toward the doors of the hall, her every step a silent promise to herself. The guests in the room were still in shock, murmurs running like a ripple through the crowd. Alistair stood frozen, his eyes burning with something that could have been anger or regret. It didn't matter now. His bride had walked away, and there was nothing he could do to stop her. The weeks that followed the ceremony were filled with whispers. The scandal of the Duke's wedding, ruined by his bride's public rejection, spread like wildfire through the noble circles. Isabella's name was spoken in hushed tones in every corner of the kingdom, but she didn't care. She had walked away from the life that had been laid out for her, and she would not look back. She found solace in the countryside, away from the prying eyes of society. The freedom she had gained from that moment in the chapel was intoxicating. For the first time in her life, Isabella was free to choose her own path. She did not need a duke, nor a title, nor the wealth and power that came with it. She only needed herself, but Alistair wasn't done. His pride, his reputation, and his desire for control all pushed him to find Isabella. The Duke of Ravensford didn't lose. He never had. He wasn't going to start now. He sought her out, traveling to the small cottage where she had hidden herself away. The moment he stepped onto the land, he was met with the scent of fresh air, the sound of birdsong, and the solitude that Isabella had chosen for herself. The Duke approached the door, his heart pounding with an unfamiliar anxiety. This wasn't the man who had once made decisions with cold precision, who had used people as pawns in his game of power. Now he was just a man, no more no less, standing at the doorstep of a woman he had lost, and the consequences of his actions weighing heavily on him. When Isabella opened the door, she found him standing there. His appearance was impeccable as always, but his eyes were different. Gone was the cold control. Now they held something raw, something she had never seen before. Isabella, Alistair began, his voice unsure. She didn't invite him in, she didn't have to. What do you want, Alistair? Her voice was steady, but there was a finality to it. I want to make it right, he said, though his words felt clumsy in the open air. I never meant for you to be hurt. Stood still, studying him. She had loved him once, or at least she had tried to. But she couldn't forgive him for the years she had spent as nothing more than a political tool. She had given him everything, and he had taken it without ever looking back. The problem isn't that I was hurt, Alistair, she said softly, her eyes hardening. The problem is that I was never seen, I was never chosen for me, I was just something to be used. Opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time he didn't have an answer. Isabella turned away, closing the door gently behind her. She wasn't angry anymore, but she couldn't stay with him. She had made her choice, she had walked away, and there was no going back. If you like this and still want to be listening to such interesting royal stories on the channel, Dark Royal Stories, don't forget to like, share, comment, and most immediately subscribe to my channel, and click the bell for more update. Alistair Warwick, Duke of Ravensford, had always prided himself on his ability to control everything in his life. From his sprawling estate to his business ventures, every aspect of his world was carefully crafted to his exact specifications. He was the man who made things happen, the one who dictated the course of events, both in his personal and professional life. But today, as he stood at the altar, the world seemed to be slipping through his fingers. Today he wasn't in control, not in the way he was used to. Today the room was filled with whispers, not of excitement for a marriage, but of disbelief, shock, and scandal. The man who had built an empire was standing at the precipice of losing it all because of a woman who up until this moment had always been in the shadows. Sophia Dunsmore, Sophia, the mistress who had been by his side for years, was now standing before him in the light of the most public ceremony of his life. As Isabella, his bride, stood beside him with a stoic expression, he could feel the tension in the air. He could see the confusion, the anger, even the pity in the eyes of the guests. The noblewomen who had long dreamed of marrying him, the men who had always envied his power, now watched as he brought the very woman they all knew he had kept in secret to the altar. Sophia stood there with grace and quiet confidence, her gown of deep red velvet contrasting beautifully with the white of Isabella's dress. She looked every bit the part of a woman who had always belonged in the Duke's life, even if no one had ever officially acknowledged it. There was no trace of doubt in her gaze, no fear, no hesitation. Sophia had always known exactly where she stood in Alistair's world. She had never needed the ceremony to validate her place. But for Isabella, this moment was the beginning of the end. Alistair had never been more acutely aware of the deep chasm between the two women in his life. He had long known the power Sophia held over him, but today it became undeniable to everyone in the room. It was not Isabella, the bride, who had captured his heart. It was Sophia, the mistress, the woman who had always known how to navigate the complex dynamics of their relationship, the woman who understood him better than anyone else ever could. The guests had fallen silent, watching the scene unfold. They could sense something had shifted in the air, something they couldn't quite name but knew was important. The Duke's public marriage to Isabella Larkspur, his carefully arranged union meant to consolidate power and solidify alliances, had taken an unexpected turn. It was no longer about the bride, and it was no longer about the Duke. It was about the woman who had quietly won the heart of the most powerful man in the kingdom. Sophia knew this well. She had never needed to wear the title of wife to hold power over Alistair. She had never needed the public ceremony, the grand gestures, or the approval of his family or his subjects. She had always been the woman he turned to when the walls of his cold, controlled life became too much to bear. She was the one who understood his silence, who knew how to navigate the intricate world he had built. And most importantly, she was the one who accepted him for who he truly was, flaws, darkness, and all. From the very beginning, Sophia had understood Alistair's nature in a way that no one else did. She had been his confidant, his lover, and his partner in ways that no one would ever know. She had never demanded more than he was willing to give. She had been content to remain in the shadows, to be the woman he came to when the weight of the world became too heavy to carry alone. But now, with Isabella standing beside him, the world was finally seeing what Sophia had known all along, that she was the one who truly held his heart. Sophia's eyes never wavered as she stood in the back of the room, watching Alistair from afar. The ceremony had begun, the vows exchanged, and the weight of the moment was not lost on her. She knew that this was a victory for her, even if it wasn't the kind of victory most people would expect. It wasn't the kind of victory that demanded applause or recognition. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of victory that only she would truly understand. Sophia had never wanted to be the Duke's wife. She didn't care for the title, the power, or the status that came with it. What she had wanted was something far more elusive: his undivided attention, his loyalty, and his love. And in that sense she had won long ago. She had always known the delicate balance between them. Alistair's marriage to Isabella was a business arrangement, a marriage born out of duty and necessity, not love. It was an alliance that made sense on paper, one that secured his future and the future of his family. But for Sophia, it had always been clear that it was never about Isabella. It had always been about her. Sophia had waited. She had bided her time, knowing that when the moment came she would be the one to stand at the altar, not as the mistress, but as the woman who had always been at the heart of everything. It wasn't arrogance that drove her, but the quiet confidence that comes from understanding one's worth. She knew what Alistair needed, even if he hadn't always admitted it to himself. When the vows were being exchanged, and Isabella stood beside Alistair in her white gown, Sophia had remained silent, watching with quiet satisfaction as the Duke recited the words. The power was no longer in his hands, it was in hers. Isabella stood beside the Duke, her heart pounding in her chest as she listened to the vows being exchanged. She had always known this moment would come, knew that the Duke's heart had never fully belonged to her. But it was one thing to know something intellectually, and it was another thing entirely to experience the cold truth of it. She had tried to bury her doubts. She had told herself that this marriage was a stepping stone, a necessary step for both her family and the Duke. She had told herself that Alistair would learn to love her, that with time she would become the woman he wanted at his side. But as she stood there now, watching him exchange vows with her heart full of quiet pain, she realized how naive she had been. Sophia had always been there in the shadows, a constant presence in Alistair's life. And now Isabella could see it for herself. The bond between them was undeniable. There was no pretending otherwise. The Duke's eyes never strayed far from Sophia, even as he recited his vows to Isabella. It wasn't love in the way Isabella had imagined it. It wasn't passion or even respect, it was something deeper, something that transcended words and titles. Isabella had spent so long trying to fit into the Duke's world, to be the woman he needed her to be, but she could see now that she had been fighting a losing battle. She was never meant to be his equal. She had been a pawn. Nothing more than a piece in his grand plan. The ceremony continued, but Isabella's heart had already shattered. The room around her felt suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a heavy stone. She knew then without a doubt that there was no place for her here, not in Alistair's heart, not in his life. And so she would leave. She would walk away from this marriage, from this charade, and from him. But Sophia, standing quietly in the back of the room, had already won. She had never needed the title of wife to claim Alistair's heart. She had known all along that it was hers for the taking. And as Isabella made her quiet exit, she realized that Sophia didn't need to say a word. Her victory had been written in every glance, every gesture, every unspoken moment between her and the Duke. When Isabella left, Alistair's eyes followed her, but his gaze quickly shifted back to Sophia, who stood in the back of the room, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched on, a tension so thick it could have been cut with a knife. The Duke made no attempt to stop Isabella. He knew in his heart that it was over. The wedding had been a failure, not because of anything Isabella had done, but because of everything he had done. He had built his life around power, control, and duty, but he had neglected the one thing that mattered most, love, and now he stood in the aftermath, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he thought he could control. Sophia, the mistress who had waited so long in the wings, was now the woman he could not ignore. But Sophia's victory was not a loud one. It was not a public affair with cheers or applause. It was quiet. It was the power of knowing exactly where you stood in the world and taking what was rightfully yours, even if no one else understood it. Sophia had won not with force or coercion, but with patience, with quiet understanding, and with a love that had been given without expectation. She was the Duke's true match, and everyone in that room knew it. Even Alistair, and so the Duke of Ravensford stood at the altar, alone in the ruins of a marriage that had never been his to begin with, as Sophia silently took her place beside him where she had always belonged. The weight of Isabella's wedding gown felt like 1,000 pounds as she stood at the altar, her hands trembling as they gripped the delicate bouquet of white lilies. The grand hall of Ravensford Castle was a masterpiece of gold and marble, the flickering candlelight casting an almost ethereal glow over the guests seated in the pews. Everything was perfect. It was supposed to be perfect, wasn't? Could hear the soft rustle of silk and velvet as noblewomen whispered to one another, exchanging polite pleasantries, their eyes furtive, glancing occasionally toward her. The men with their finely tailored suits watched with muted interest, their expressions carefully composed as they observed the spectacle unfolding before them. She was the bride after all, the star of the evening. Her wedding, the union of two powerful houses, was an event not to be missed. But the truth was, she wasn't the star of the night, not really. She wasn't even the center of her own life. The title of Duchess would be hers, but the man she was about to marry, Alistair Warwick, Duke of Ravensford, would never truly belong to her. Her gaze wandered up to where he stood beside her, towering and imposing every inch the Duke. He was resplendent in his deep blue coat and black trousers, his golden cufflinks glinting in the dim light. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his sharp jawline was set with that familiar, almost arrogant expression. To the outside world, Alistair Warwick was a man who had everything. He was powerful, feared, respected, and above all adored, but not by her. Not really. Isabella's chest tightened as she took in the sight of him. He didn't look at her, not truly. His eyes, dark and calculating, swept across the crowd, never lingering on her for more than a moment. The Duke was a man who had long mastered the art of control, a man who had built his life around duty, loyalty, and power. There was no room in his world for softness, no room for emotion or vulnerability. Certainly there was no room for love, not for her anyway. Their marriage had been arranged years ago, and Isabella had known from the very beginning that she was never meant to be his love. She was a piece in a grand political game, a woman born of a wealthy merchant family, chosen to solidify an alliance to further the interests of both their houses. The marriage was a contract, not a romance. It was a business arrangement and nothing more. But as she stood there in front of him, her heart heavy with the truth of it all, she realized something that made her stomach twist in knots. She had always known the reality of their marriage, but until this moment she had convinced herself that perhaps with time something could change. She had allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, love would grow between them, that Alistair would come to see her as something more than just a tool to secure his power. But the truth was undeniable now. As Alistair spoke his vows in a steady, practiced voice, Isabella's heart sank deeper into her chest. His words were rehearsed, devoid of warmth. There was no love in them, no tenderness, no passion. He spoke the words with the kind of detached indifference one would use when signing a contract or making a business transaction. I, Alistair Warwick, Duke of Ravensford, take thee, Isabella Larkspur, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do us part. His voice was so smooth, so composed. The words came easily, as though they had no weight, no meaning. Isabella felt the cold, bitter truth of it all settle in her bones. She was nothing more than a pawn, a tool, a strategic move in his game of power. She wasn't the woman he loved. She wasn't even the woman he cared about. He had accepted her as his wife because it suited his needs, because it was the next logical step in the business of the dukedom. But love had never been part of the equation. And now, as she stood there, dressed in a gown that symbolized purity and commitment, Isabella realized that she had been fooling herself all along. The ceremony was a blur. The vows were exchanged, the ring slipped onto her finger with the cold finality of a chain being locked. Isabella didn't feel the weight of the ring, not in the way she should have. It didn't symbolize a bond of love, of partnership, of mutual respect. It was simply a ring. Another link in a chain that had bound her to this life, to this man, from the moment her family had arranged the marriage. Alistair was no longer even looking at her as the officiant spoke the final words. His attention was on something, or rather someone else. Isabella followed his gaze for the briefest moment, her stomach tightening as she saw her. Sophia Dunsmore, the woman who had been by Alistair's side for years. The woman who had never once had to wear the title of wife to hold power over the Duke. Sophia was standing in the back of the room, watching the ceremony with a quiet confidence that made Isabella's skin crawl. She knew as well as Isabella did what this wedding truly meant, and Sophia, ever the silent observer, seemed to wear her triumph like a cloak. Isabella's heart broke a little more with every passing second. She had always known Sophia was a part of Alistair's life, but to see her here, standing so proudly in the background in full view of everyone, was a slap in the face. She had never been the Duke's true partner. Sophia had always been the one who truly held his heart. The truth was too much to bear. Alistair had never truly seen her. He had never looked at her as more than an alliance, a way to secure his position, to solidify his control over the lands and businesses that were his family's legacy. She was a piece of the puzzle, nothing more. But Sophia was the woman who had been his equal, his confidant, the one he turned to when the weight of his crown became too much to bear. And now, in this moment, Isabella understood the unspoken truth that had always lingered between them. She had never been enough. As the ceremony continued and the guests cheered politely for the newly wedded couple, Isabella felt as if she were suffocating. She could hear the laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the soft murmur of conversation, but it all felt so far away. The world around her was moving in slow motion, as if she were underwater, unable to escape the suffocating pressure of the situation. She felt a hand on her arm, and for a moment she thought it was Alistair. But when she turned, it was not her husband who stood beside her, it was her father. He looked at her with pride, but there was something else in his eyes, he knew. He knew what this marriage had been from the start. He knew that it had never been about love, and now he could see the truth written on his daughter's face. He could see the pain, the hurt, the realization that everything she had hoped for had been a lie. Isabella, her father whispered, his voice soft and concerned. Are you all right? She met his gaze, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The truth was too painful. There was no way to explain how the dreams she had once had for this day had crumbled in the face of reality. She couldn't say the words out loud, but her heart was screaming them. This wasn't what I wanted. She turned away, blinking back the tears, and for the first time she realized that she had a choice. She had a choice. It was the first time in her life that she felt truly free. She didn't have to stay in this marriage. She didn't have to continue playing the role of the dutiful wife, standing by a man who didn't love her. She didn't have to live a life of duty and power and duty without love. But was she brave enough to walk away? Was she willing to risk everything for her freedom? She looked back toward Alistair, who was now whispering something to Sophia. He had not even noticed her slip away, not even noticed her internal struggle. He was lost in his world of control, power, and ambition. He had everything he wanted, and she had never been part of that equation. As the ceremony drew to close, Isabella made her decision. She would no longer be a pawn in this game. She would walk away from the altar, from the Duke, from the life she had known. She would leave the facade behind and forge her own path. The ring on her finger would be the final symbol of everything she had lost, but it would also be the symbol of the strength she had found in that moment. Isabella Larkspur would no longer be bound by duty. She would walk away and find her own way, one step at a time. She had made her choice. The cathedral was silent, save for the faint rustle of Isabella's wedding gown as she stood at the altar. The sacred space was grand, its towering arches, stained glass windows, and golden candle holders making it feel like a dream. The guests, finely dressed and with expressions of curiosity or envy, whispered amongst themselves, their voices reverberating in the high, echoing ceilings of the grand hall. But all Isabella could hear was the pounding of her own heart. Alistair Warwick, the Duke of Ravensford, stood beside her, a figure of calm perfection. His dark hair was meticulously combed back, his posture regal, his sharp features set in that typical emotionless mask he wore to keep the world at bay. To the guests, he looked every bit the man they had expected, powerful, controlled, and almost untouchable. Yet for Isabella, standing next to him now, he was no more than a stranger, an unfamiliar, cold figure who stood before her not as the man she had once hoped to love, but as the symbol of everything that had gone wrong in her life. She had spent years imagining this day, but none of the fantasy she had spun in her mind had ever matched this reality. This wasn't the union of two hearts. It wasn't a coming together of two people who had been brought together by love. No, this was a transaction. A business deal disguised as a wedding. Alistair's aloofness had confirmed it time and time again. The vows had been spoken with mechanical precision. Alistair's voice was steady, calm, but empty. Every word that came from his lips felt like a rehearsed performance, a ritual devoid of any genuine affection. Isabella had known what to expect, had known deep down that this was the life she had been chosen for, the life she had to accept for the sake of her family's security and her own survival. But as she stood there in the long silence after the vows had been exchanged, something inside her began to unravel. Alistair had never truly seen her. He had never loved her. She had known it all along, but now, standing here in front of everyone with the weight of the ring on her finger and the veil over her face, she understood the full extent of the lie. It wasn't just that he didn't love her. It was that he had never even cared to look at her beyond the surface. His eyes hadn't lingered on her once throughout the ceremony. He had glanced briefly at her, of course, but only out of duty. His focus had been elsewhere, always elsewhere, on his empire, his power, and on the woman standing at the back of the room, Sophia. The name echoed in Isabella's mind like a bitter echo. Sophia Dunsmore, the woman who had been his lover for years, the woman who had claimed his heart long before Isabella had even been a part of the equation. The woman who had been brought here to their wedding as a silent spectator, as though she were a part of the ceremony herself. Isabella turned her gaze towards the back of the cathedral. There stood Sophia, her posture relaxed, a quiet confidence radiating from her. Sophia's gown of crimson silk shimmered in the light, contrasting sharply with the purity of Isabella's white bridal dress. But it wasn't just Sophia's gown that stood in stark contrast to Isabella. It was the air around her, an undeniable aura of power and confidence. The air of someone who belonged here, who had always belonged, who was never an afterthought. Isabella had spent years pretending to be the woman Alistair had wanted her to be. She had tried to step into the role, to wear the mask of the dutiful bride, the obedient daughter of the Larkspur family. But in that moment, as she watched Sophia stand there, she realized the cruelest truth of all: Alistair had never wanted her. Not truly, he had never chosen her. He had chosen the marriage because it was necessary. And Sophia had always been the one he wanted. A part of Isabella's soul broke at that moment, the part of her that had been clinging to the hope that maybe one day things could change. But at that moment it was all clear. This marriage wasn't about love, it wasn't about her. It never had been. Isabella felt the cold weight of the ring on her finger, the symbol of a life she had never chosen. Her fingers brushed against the band, the metal cool against her skin. It felt like an anchor dragging her down into the depths of a life she was never meant to live. She didn't want to wear it. She didn't want to be the Duke's wife, standing beside him as a mere accessory to his grand empire. She didn't want to be the dutiful wife who sat beside him in meetings and smiled at his guests, all the while knowing that her presence meant nothing. With a sudden clarity, she made her decision. It was not a rash decision. It was the culmination of years of pain and disappointment, of trying to convince herself that this life could be hers. Without thinking, without hesitation, Isabella reached up and gently removed the wedding ring from her finger. The motion was so smooth, so fluid, it felt almost like a reflex. She held the ring in her hand for a moment, the cool metal reflecting the candlelight. Alistair didn't even notice. With a steady hand, Isabella placed the ring on the velvet cushion held out by the officiant. The act was a quiet rebellion, a defiance that reverberated in her chest. The eyes of the guests were on her now, their murmurs filling the space between them like a low hum. She met Alistair's gaze, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands trembling slightly as she held her place. His eyes flickered over her for the briefest moment, but there was no real recognition in them, no understanding of what she was about to do. There was no connection, there was only the cold indifference that had characterized their entire relationship. Isabella took a breath, her voice steady but cold as she spoke the words that would forever change her life. "Then he's yours." Words hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving, like a dagger driven into the heart of everything Alistair had built. The silence that followed was deafening. The guests held their breath, the tension so thick that it seemed to freeze the very air. Alistair's eyes widened, and for the first time in their entire relationship he looked at her, not as a political pawn, not as a tool for his ambitions, but as a woman who had finally found her voice. He opened his mouth but no words came out. His hands clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with a mixture of confusion and anger, but there was no time for him to react. There was nothing he could say to take back the moment that had just unfolded. Isabella turned on her heel, her heart racing in her chest as she began to walk away from the altar, from the wedding, from the life she had been expected to live. As Isabella made her way down the aisle, her footsteps echoed like a drumbeat in her chest. She didn't look back, didn't wait for Alistair to stop her, didn't wait for anyone to call her name. The decision had been made, she was done. The guests parted to let her pass, their eyes full of pity, surprise, and confusion. But Isabella felt none of it. She had made her choice and it was hers alone to bear. For the first time in her life she felt the weight of freedom, the kind of freedom that came with walking away from everything she had known. Isabella stepped out of the cathedral and into the cool evening air, her chest still tight with the intensity of what had just happened. But beneath that tightness there was something else, something lighter, something liberating. She didn't look back as she made her way down the stone steps, her gown trailing behind her like a cloud of white. She didn't care what the world would say about her. She didn't care that her name would be spoken in hushed tones across the kingdom. All that mattered now was that she was free. Back inside the cathedral, Alistair stood frozen at the altar, staring at the place where Isabella had been moments before. His heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing as he tried to process the words she had spoken. "Then he's yours." The words reverberated in his ears over and over again until they lost all meaning. Sophia stood at the back of the room, her expression unreadable, but her eyes gleamed with something dangerous, something triumphant. She had always known this day would come. She had always known that Isabella would walk away, and Alistair, he had never seen it coming. The consequences of Isabella's choice were just beginning, for Alistair, for Sophia, and for Isabella herself. This was no longer about marriage, alliances, or power. This was about something far more difficult to navigate: emotion, heartache, and the truth that could never be undone. Isabella had made her choice, and for the first time she was living for herself. The grand hall was silent except for the distant hum of conversation and the creak of the ornate doors as they slowly closed behind Isabella. The church, once filled with the vibrant energy of guests eager for a royal wedding, now felt like a mausoleum. The air, thick with tension, seemed to press in on Alistair Warwick from all sides. He had been a figure of immense power, respected, feared, admired, but now standing at the altar alone he was nothing more than a man facing the ruin of everything he had spent his life building. His bride was gone. The woman he had wed in a political transaction, the woman whose name he had once said in a vow that felt as cold as the stone beneath his feet, was gone. And what was worse, what gnawed at the core of his being, was that it was because of him. His pride, his power, his arrogance had led him here. The guests had fallen silent, eyes wide, unsure whether this was some sort of dramatic jest. Was it a test, a moment meant to shake things up, to add excitement to the spectacle? But then, as they saw the empty space beside him where Isabella had stood moments before, reality began to sink in. Alistair's grip tightened around the hilt of his sword, his knuckles whitening. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, his body feeling as though it were sinking into the ground. It was too much for any man to bear, and certainly too much for someone like him, someone who had never shown weakness to anyone, least of all to the people who looked to him as their duke. He had been raised to lead. He had been raised to control. Yet here he was, control slipping through his fingers like sand. His gaze turned to Sophia, who stood at the back of the room, the woman he had always known would be by his side. She was everything Isabella was not: bold, confident, a quiet force of nature. And now she stood in the shadows, watching, waiting. Alistair's heart twisted in his chest. He could feel her gaze on him, the weight of her silent judgment pressing into his skin. She had never asked for anything, had never demanded anything more than what he had offered her. And yet in the end it was her quiet patience that had made her victorious. Sophia's eyes met his, a small flicker of something in her gaze. Whether it was pity, triumph, or a mixture of both, Alistair couldn't quite tell. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered now except the fallout from Isabella's departure. Alistair had been invincible, or at least he had always felt that way. The Duke of Ravensford, heir to a centuries-old legacy, the mastermind behind the thriving empire of the kingdom. His word had been law, his decisions had been final. In the courtrooms, the parlors, the corridors of power, no one dared challenge him. But now, standing alone in the center of that grand hall, he realized just how fragile the empire he had built truly was. The whispers were already starting. The crowd was beginning to murmur among themselves, speaking in hushed tones. They saw the Duke for what he was now, a man whose marriage had fallen apart in front of them all, whose carefully constructed world had crumbled at the hands of a woman who had no power, no title, no connection, just a cold, calculated choice to walk away. Alistair's eyes fell to the velvet cushion where Isabella had placed the ring. It seemed so small, so insignificant now, lying there like the symbol of everything he had lost. At that moment, Alistair realized that no amount of wealth, no amount of land, no number of political alliances could undo what had just happened. He had lost the only thing that truly mattered, control over his own life. As the ceremony came to an abrupt and awkward end, the guests began to file out of the hall. There was no grand exit for him, no applause. There was only the sound of their footsteps, their whispered conversations, and the feeling that the walls were closing in. The Duke, who had once commanded an empire, was now reduced to nothing more than a man left standing in the wreckage of his own making. Sophia remained behind, waiting until the last of the guests had filtered out. The air between her and Alistair crackled with tension as he finally turned to face her, his eyes betraying a mixture of regret and frustration. "Not look at me like that," she said, her voice steady and cold. "You knew this was coming." Didn't answer her at first, his eyes lingering on her, trying to find something to say, something to undo the devastation of the moment. But no words came. What could he say? "I never wanted this for you," she continued, her eyes softening just slightly as she approached him. "But you made your choices, Alistair, and now you will have to live with them." "I didn't want her to leave," he finally managed to speak, his voice thick with emotion. Sophia gave him a knowing look. "But you never truly wanted her either, did you?" He didn't answer her. What could he say to that? She was right. Isabella had always been a duty, a means to an end. She had never been the woman he loved, but he had convinced himself for a time that she could be. He had tried to make himself care for her, but the truth was it had always been Sophia. It had always been her. Sophia reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. "This is the life you chose, Alistair. You made your bed and now you will lie in it. There is no turning back from this." His face twisted with frustration. "Is that what you want, to see me fall?" "No," she replied, her voice calm, even detached. "I don't want to see you fall, I simply want to see you face what you've done. You've taken your life and your power for granted, Alistair, and now you've lost it all." The words stung, but he couldn't deny their truth. Isabella had walked away, and with her went the last shred of his carefully cultivated image as the untouchable Duke. While Alistair stood alone in the hall, surrounded by the ruins of his world, Isabella was far from the reach of the prying eyes of the court. She had fled Ravensford Castle, escaping into the open fields beyond the walls, away from the suffocating expectations of society, away from the watchful eyes of those who had always seen her as just another piece in a political game. For the first time, Isabella felt free. The heavy weight of her wedding gown had been replaced by the freedom of choice. She was no longer bound by the marriage contract, no longer confined to the life that had been dictated to her. She was free to choose her own path, to step into a future that was hers alone to define, but freedom came with its own set of challenges. As she made her way through the countryside, her heart heavy with the reality of her actions, she couldn't shake the feeling that her decision to walk away had only just begun to unfold. The kingdom would talk, the nobles would gossip, she would be painted as a woman who had abandoned her marriage, her duty, and her place in society. The whispers would follow her wherever she went, but even the whispers could not break the resolve that had solidified in her chest. She had made her choice. She had walked away from the life that had been forced upon her, and now she would create a new one that was truly hers. Back in the castle, Alistair sat alone in his study, the weight of the world pressing down on him. The lavish room, filled with opulent furnishings and fine art, seemed to mock him now. He was the Duke, but the title had never felt more hollow. His empire, once so solid and unyielding, now seemed fragile, built on the shifting sands of his own mistakes. He thought of Isabella, of how her face had looked when she had placed the ring back on the cushion, her words echoing in his mind. "Then he's yours." It wasn't just her words that stung. It was the look in her eyes, the look of a woman who had finally realized that she was worth more than the life he had offered her. And then there was Sophia. He had always known she had power over him, but seeing her in the aftermath of his failure, standing so quietly, so assured of herself, made him feel smaller than he had ever felt in his life. She had been right all along. She had never demanded anything from him. She had never asked for his title, his power, his wealth. She had been content in her own place, waiting until the moment came when she would no longer be a secret. And now, that moment had arrived. The kingdom had its eyes on him now, and they would see his weakness for what it was. They would see the cracks in the Duke's perfect facade. But what they didn't know, what none of them could know, was that Alistair Warwick had never been more vulnerable than he was at this moment. And Isabella was no longer a part of his world. She had walked away, leaving him with nothing but the consequences of his choices. Sophia Dunsmore stood at the back of the grand hall, her heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm as the ceremony unfolded before her. She had always been a part of Alistair Warwick's life, lurking in the shadows, never quite allowed to step into the light. But today, everything has changed. Today, she would no longer be hidden. Today, the power she had quietly wielded would be acknowledged by all. Her eyes scanned the room, noting the delicate dance of whispers, the subtle glances exchanged between the nobles as they observed the wedding ceremony. She could feel the anticipation in the air, the excitement of a marriage that promised to shift the very balance of power in the kingdom. But none of that mattered to her. For Sophia, this was no ordinary wedding. This was her moment, the culmination of years spent waiting in the wings, watching as Isabella Larkspur, the Duke's intended bride, took center stage. Sophia had never been one to seek the spotlight. She had never desired the title of Duchess or the wealth and status that came with it. She had always known her place in the Duke's world. She had been the mistress, the woman who existed in the quiet spaces between public appearances, the one who had been kept hidden from the prying eyes of the court. She had always accepted her role, knowing it was the only one she could have in a world so governed by appearances and politics. But what she hadn't accepted not until this moment was the limitations of that role. Being the Duke's mistress had never been enough. It had never been enough to be kept in the shadows, never enough to simply be the woman he turned to in the quiet hours of the night. It had never been enough to be the one he called when the weight of the world became too much for him to bear. Sophia was tired of being hidden. She was tired of existing in the spaces where no one could see her, where she could never fully claim her place in the world. She had waited patiently for years, biding her time as Alistair navigated the political landscape of his life, playing the role of the untouchable Duke while she waited in the wings, the silent partner in his success. But that had all changed today. Today Isabella had walked away from the altar, and Sophia knew in that moment that she would no longer be relegated to the background. As the ceremony came to an abrupt end, and Isabella made her silent exit, Sophia stepped forward from the back of the room. The eyes of the guests flickered toward her as she moved with quiet confidence toward the altar. For the first time she allowed herself to feel the weight of the stares, the whispers, the judgment. She had always been the woman behind the scenes, but now she was stepping into the light, embracing a new role, a role she had always known was hers to take. Alistair stood at the altar, his face a mask of confusion and frustration. His eyes searched the room for Isabella, but she was already gone. His gaze shifted toward Sophia, and for the first time he saw her not just as the woman who had stood by his side in the shadows, but as someone who was now claiming her space in the world. The way he looked at her now was different. There was no longer the familiar detachment in his eyes. There was recognition. Sophia reached him, standing beside him with an air of quiet triumph. She could feel the tension between them, the unsaid words hanging in the air like a thick fog. Alistair didn't speak at first. He was still processing what had just happened, the shock of Isabella's departure still reverberating through his mind. But Sophia wasn't waiting for him to process anything. She had waited long enough. "You've lost her," Sophia said softly, her voice laced with an edge of triumph. "And now you have me." Alistair turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice a mixture of frustration and curiosity. Sophia smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "What I mean, Alistair, is that this is no longer about her. This is about you and me. For too long I have stood in the background, in the shadows, watching you from afar, but no longer." Was silent for a moment, his gaze flickering with something that could have been realization or fear. But whatever it was, it didn't matter. Sophia was no longer interested in the games he played. She had been waiting, watching, and now she was ready to claim what had always been hers. Sophia had known deep down that this day would come. She had known that Alistair's marriage to Isabella was never going to be the end of their story. There had always been a quiet understanding between them, a bond that transcended titles and social expectations. They had been two people cut from the same cloth, both driven, both willing to do whatever it took to secure their place in the world. But now, as Sophia stood beside him, she realized that it wasn't just about love. It wasn't about loyalty or affection. It was about power, and Sophia was no fool. She had never been naive enough to believe that Alistair had ever truly been hers. She had known that from the start. But what she had never been willing to accept was that she could never rise above the role of mistress. Now, with Isabella gone and Alistair standing before her, Sophia knew that this was her chance. This was her moment to step out of the shadows and claim her place beside him, not as a mistress, not as a side note in the Duke's life, but as his equal. The kingdom had watched Isabella walk away from her marriage to Alistair, but Sophia knew that they had no idea what was coming next. They thought this was the end of Alistair's story, the collapse of his carefully constructed world. But Sophia knew better. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. She had played her part for years, waiting for the moment when she could finally step into the light. And now that moment had arrived. Sophia was no longer just the woman in the background. She was the woman who had stood by Alistair's side through every triumph, every failure. She was the woman who knew him better than anyone else. And now she was ready to take her place by his side, no longer hidden, no longer a secret. The days that followed Isabella's departure were filled with whispers. The court was in turmoil. The nobles had all expected the grand union between the Duke and his bride to be the final step in securing the stability of the kingdom. But with Isabella gone and the Duke now openly standing beside his mistress, the future was uncertain. But to Sophia, the uncertainty wasn't a burden, it was an opportunity. She had been biding her time, watching, waiting for the moment when the world would finally understand that she was not just an accessory to Alistair's life, she was a force. And now, with Isabella gone, the kingdom would be forced to reckon with that truth. Sophia moved through the halls of Ravensford Castle with newfound confidence. The whispers no longer made her shrink back into the shadows. She no longer needed to hide. She was not just the Duke's mistress anymore. She was his partner, his equal. Alistair had always relied on her, had always turned to her when things became difficult. And now, with Isabella out of the picture, he would need her more than ever. He needed her to help him rebuild, to reclaim what had been lost. But this time Sophia would no longer be content with merely supporting him. She was ready to take her place at the forefront. She was ready to rise to power. Sophia's rise was not a loud one. It wasn't marked by grand speeches or dramatic declarations. It was a quiet, calculated move, a gradual shift in the dynamics of the kingdom. As Alistair worked to rebuild his reputation, Sophia was right there by his side, guiding him with a deft touch, offering advice when needed, making decisions when necessary. She had always understood the world of power better than most, and now, with Alistair in her corner, she was poised to take what had always been denied to her. It wasn't just about securing a place beside him, it was about securing her own legacy. Sophia understood power in a way no one else did. She understood the delicate balance between fear and respect, between control and influence. She had watched Alistair work his way through the world, manipulating those around him with ease. But now it was her turn. She was no longer going to be content with playing the role of the silent partner. She wanted more, she wanted everything. And as the days passed, it became clear to everyone around her that Sophia Dunsmore was no longer the woman standing quietly in the background. She was the woman at the center of it all. The Duke's true partner, his equal, and perhaps in time the most powerful woman in the kingdom. Sophia's hidden triumph had finally been realized, and nothing would stand in her way. Alistair Warwick, Duke of Ravensford, had spent his entire life building an empire rooted in power, control, and ambition. He had been molded by his father to become a man who would never falter, a man who would never allow sentiment or weakness to govern his actions. It had been a necessary survival mechanism, a way to maintain the legacy of the Warwick name and to protect everything his family had worked for over generations, and it worked. For years, Alistair had commanded respect, fear, and admiration from those around him. The Duke's word was law, his decisions unchallenged. He was a figure of authority, feared and revered in equal measure, known for his unshakable resolve and his ability to remain calm in the face of every storm. His power had been his most valuable asset, and it was a power he had wielded without question, without hesitation. But as he stood in the silent aftermath of Isabella's departure, he realized that the very thing that had made him invincible had now become his undoing. Isabella's words echoed in his mind over and over again. "Then he's yours." Alistair stood at the altar, watching as the woman who had been meant to be his wife walked away from him, without hesitation, without a single glance back. He could feel the eyes of the entire room on him, the weight of their gaze pressing down on him like an insurmountable burden. The applause, the cheering, the excitement of the day had all faded into a deafening silence. He had lost, the moment was surreal. In the midst of the grandeur of the ceremony, the gleaming golden chandeliers, the intricate floral arrangements, the fine silks and velvet of the guests' attire, Alistair felt as though the world had shifted beneath his feet. The walls of the grand hall, which had always seemed so strong, now appeared fragile, as though they could crumble at any moment. The perfection of his carefully constructed world had shattered in an instant, and he had no idea how to fix it. Alistair's heart raced, his chest tightening with a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, something raw, something vulnerable. He wasn't sure if it was shock, fear, or regret, but he knew one thing for certain: it was the feeling of losing control, losing everything. For years, Alistair had relied on his ability to control every aspect of his life. His family, his business dealings, his relationships, everything had been calculated, carefully planned, and executed with precision. He had allowed no room for emotion, no space for vulnerability. He had learned early on that feelings were dangerous. They clouded judgment, weakened resolve, and could be used against you. He had seen it in his father's eyes when Alistair had been just a boy, watching his father use warmth and affection as a tool to manipulate him, to break him. The lesson had been clear. Love was not a luxury he could afford, and so he had built his life around power, around duty. He had never allowed himself the freedom to love, to feel. He had kept his emotions locked away, buried beneath layers of cold ambition and calculated decisions. And for a time, it had worked. But now, in the wake of Isabella's departure, Alistair was forced to confront the harsh truth. His life had been a carefully constructed facade. A facade that had crumbled in the face of the one thing he had tried so desperately to avoid: emotion. The emotions he had buried for so long were now rising to the surface, and he didn't know how to deal with them. He had lost Isabella not because she had walked away from him, but because he had never truly seen her. He had never allowed himself to. She had been a pawn in his world of politics and power, a woman who was meant to strengthen his position, not to be someone he could truly love. He had treated her as a tool, nothing more. He had never considered her feelings, never thought about what she needed or wanted from their marriage. He had never asked himself if she could ever truly love him, or if he could ever love her in return. Alistair paced in the empty hall, his hands clenched into fists by his sides, his mind racing. He had always been a man of action, a man who prided himself on his ability to make decisions quickly and decisively. But now he is paralyzed. There was no clear path forward. There was no clear way to fix the damage he had caused. The kingdom had watched the spectacle unfold. Isabella's departure had been a public rejection of him, of his title, and of everything he had worked for. It was a slap in the face, a humiliating moment that would be discussed in hushed tones in every corner of the kingdom. His reputation was in tatters. The once feared Duke of Ravensford was now a man who had lost everything, standing alone at the altar with no one left to claim him. Sophia, his mistress, stood at the back of the hall, watching him with quiet amusement. Her eyes were filled with something that could have been pity or triumph, but whatever it was clear she had always known this day would come. She had been the one person who had never demanded anything from him, who had never tried to change him. And now, as Isabella walked away, Sophia was the one left standing in the wings, the one left to claim the space Isabella had vacated. Alistair couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy at the thought. Sophia had always been there, had always accepted him for who he was unconditionally. But in the end, that acceptance had been enough for her. She had never needed him to change, she had never needed him to love her. And now it seemed she was about to claim everything he had lost. The realization hit Alistair like a wave crashing against the shore. He had never truly loved anyone, not his father, not Isabella, and certainly not Sophia, not in the way he should have. He had never allowed himself the luxury of love, of true connection, because love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant weakness. But as he stood there alone, the emptiness of his own heart weighed heavily on him. The power he had so carefully crafted, the empire he had built, now seemed insignificant compared to the void that stretched out before him. He had spent his life chasing power, only to find that it had cost him everything he had ever truly wanted. The image of Isabella's face, the pain, the betrayal in her eyes haunted him. He had always been a man of control, and yet in that moment he had lost control completely. He had driven the only woman who had ever cared about him away. And now he was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had never been truly his. What was left for him now? Was there any way to rebuild what he had lost? Or was it too late? Alistair's gaze drifted toward Sophia, who had quietly moved to the front of the hall. She stood there, her posture poised, her eyes glinting with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "Is this what you wanted?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "To see me broken?" Sophia's eyes softened, and for the first time Alistair saw a flicker of something resembling sympathy in her gaze. She stepped toward him, her footsteps silent on the marble floor. "No, Alistair," she said softly. "I never wanted to see you broken, but I think you needed to be. You needed to see the price of the power you've always sought, the price of everything you've ever believed in." Alistair closed his eyes, his head spinning. He had always believed that power was everything, that control was the key to happiness, to success, to survival. But now, standing in the wreckage of his life, he realized that power had come at a steep cost. He had sacrificed everything, his heart, his soul, his capacity for love, all in the name of ambition. "It too late?" he whispered, more to himself than to Sophia. "Is it too late to choose something different, to choose love?" Sophia was silent for a long moment before answering. When she spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "It's never too late to change, Alistair, but whether you'll be able to change in time, that's another question." Alistair stood there, facing the truth of his situation for the first time in his life. The man he had been, the cold, calculating duke who never allowed himself to feel, to love, was no more. The world he had built was crumbling around him, and now he was left to rebuild from the ground up. He had always believed that love was a weakness, but now, in the wake of everything he had lost, he understood the true cost of that belief. The price of power was too high. The price of control had cost him everything that had ever mattered. But the question remained, could he choose love now? Could he learn to open his heart to something more than ambition, more than duty? The answer wasn't clear. But one thing was, it was too late for Isabella. And the damage was done. Alistair had broken the one chance he had ever had at love. And now, he would have to live with the consequences for the rest of his life. The first steps were always the hardest. Isabella Larkspur could feel the weight of her wedding gown dragging behind her as she walked away from the grand hall of Ravensford Castle. Each step, each movement seemed to echo in the vast emptiness of the cathedral, the heavy silence broken only by the faint rustling of her gown and the sound of her own heartbeat. The grand ceremony had ended, but for her the journey was just beginning. She hadn't expected to feel so heavy as she walked away. She had envisioned this moment for so long, the moment when she would break free, the moment when she would no longer be bound by the marriage that had never been anything more than a transaction. But as she moved through the shadows of the castle, out into the open fields that stretched before her, a strange feeling of both liberation and loss surged within her. The ring had been removed, the symbol of the life she was supposed to lead, and it had felt like cutting the last tie that bound her to the life she had been forced to accept. But what came after was nothing she had prepared for. Freedom. Isabella had never been free. Her entire life had been molded by the expectations of others. From her earliest memories, she had been groomed to fit into a role that was never hers to choose. Daughter of the Larkspur family, she was always expected to be obedient, to make the right connections, to marry the right man, and to uphold the family's standing. Her own desires, her own needs, had always been secondary to the needs of the family and the legacy of the Larkspur name. And then came Alistair. The Duke of Ravensford had appeared in her life like a force of nature, sweeping her into a world of wealth, power, and politics. She had been young, naive, and eager to please. She had been told that a marriage to the Duke would secure her place in the world, both for her family and for herself. And so she had gone along with it, but Alistair had never truly been hers. She had always been a means to an end, a piece of a political puzzle. The ceremony had been the final confirmation of that truth. The Duke had never seen her, never truly understood her. And when Isabella had removed her ring and walked away, the final tether had snapped. For the first time in her life, Isabella was truly free. But what did freedom mean when you had spent your entire life in a cage? Isabella didn't know where she was going. She had no plans, no grand vision for the future. The only thing she knew was that she couldn't stay at Ravensford Castle, not with the weight of her past pressing down on her. She couldn't return to her family either. not when they had been the ones to push her into this marriage in the first place. The open road ahead was both daunting and thrilling. She had always been a woman of responsibility, bound by the roles others had placed on her. But now, with each step she took, she felt something she had never known before. Freedom. She had been walking for hours, the landscape stretching before her in all its wild, untamed beauty. The rolling hills, the quiet forests, the birds flying overhead, all of it seemed so vast, so unfamiliar to her. She had lived in the city in the glittering court, surrounded by the comforts of noble life. But now she was outside of it all, in the raw world, untethered. It felt like a breath of fresh air. Isabella had no destination, no goal in mind. She only knew that she needed to distance herself from the life she had known. She had to escape the shadows of the royal contract that had defined her for so long. And as the sun began to dip below the horizon, she found herself at the edge of a small village, a place far removed from the opulence and expectations of the court. It was here that she met Mary. Mary was a simple woman. She was the innkeeper's wife, and her life was as far removed from the world of nobility as one could imagine. Her clothes were plain, her hands rough from work, and her smile was warm and welcoming. She greeted Isabella with open arms when she arrived at the small inn, exhausted from her journey. "You look like you've walked a great distance, miss," Mary remarked, her eyes taking in Isabella's bedraggled appearance. Isabella smiled softly, feeling the weight of her own exhaustion. I'm just passing through." "Well, you're welcome to stay here the night if you'd like," Mary offered, leading Isabella inside the cozy inn. It was a far cry from the cold, imposing castle she had left behind. The warm fire crackled in the hearth, the smell of stew wafted through the air, and the simplicity of it all felt like a balm to Isabella's soul. As Mary prepared a meal for her, Isabella sat by the fire, her thoughts racing. She had no idea what the future held. She had no home, no family to return to. She had no title, no wealth, no position in society. But as she watched Mary work, she realized something. Freedom wasn't about having everything. It was about having the choice to do what you wanted, to be who you were, without the expectations of others weighing you down. That night, as she lay in the small, comfortable bed, Isabella allowed herself to drift off to sleep with a feeling she had never known before: peace. The next morning, after a simple breakfast of bread and cheese, Mary sat across from Isabella. Her gaze was gentle but perceptive, and it was clear she had noticed the weight of the past Isabella was carrying. "I can see you've been through a great deal," Mary said softly, her voice kind. "The road to freedom isn't always an easy one, but you've made the right choice, miss. You can see that now, can't you?" Isabella nodded, the truth of her words sinking in. She had always believed that duty was her path, duty to her family, duty to the kingdom, duty to the Duke. But now, for the first time, she saw that duty didn't have to be her life. It could be a choice, but it didn't have to define her. "I don't know what to do with myself," Isabella admitted, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I've spent my entire life living for others, living for a contract. Now that I'm free, I don't know where to go or who I am without all of those expectations." Mary smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "You're more than just the expectations of others. You're more than the contract you were bound to. Take it one step at a time. Let the world show you who you are, instead of letting it tell you who you should be." Took a deep breath, absorbing Mary's words. There was wisdom in them, wisdom she had never been given the chance to learn. In the courts of Ravensford, she had been told who to be, what to wear, how to speak, and where to stand. But now, for the first time, she had no expectations placed upon her. She was free to be who she wanted to be, and that freedom, as terrifying as it was hers to shape. Days turned into weeks, and Isabella found herself growing more comfortable in her new life. She stayed in the village for a while, helping Mary with the inn and learning the simple, fulfilling tasks that came with it. She helped wash dishes, clean the rooms, and even assisted with the local markets. The work was hard, but it felt honest. It felt real. For the first time, Isabella was doing something that wasn't tied to a title or expectation. She was just living, but even as she worked to build a life for herself, she couldn't deny the feeling of longing that still flickered within her. She was free, yes, but part of her yearned for something more. She had been taught to believe that love was an illusion, that duty was everything. But now, after everything that had happened, she wondered, could she find love? Could she build a future with someone who saw her for who she truly was, not the woman she had been made to be? The questions lingered in her mind, but she no longer felt the need to answer them right away. She was free to explore her heart, to find her own path, without worrying about the weight of a contract or a title or a man who had never truly seen her. As the months passed, Isabella's transformation became undeniable. She was no longer the quiet, obedient woman she had once been. She had shed the skin of the woman who had walked down the aisle to marry a man she had never loved. Now she was a woman in charge of her own destiny, stronger, braver, and freer than she had ever been. And somewhere along the way, she realized that she didn't need permission to live. She didn't need the approval of her family, of Alistair, or of anyone else to forge her own future. Her past might have shaped her, but it did not define her. As the seasons changed, so too did Isabella. She had found a home in this simple village, a place where she could be herself without the constant pressure of who she was supposed to be. And maybe, just maybe, love would find its way to her when she was ready to let it in. But for now, freedom was enough. Isabella was no longer just the bride of a duke. She was a woman who had walked away from everything and in doing so had found the most precious thing of all, herself. The sun was setting over Ravensford Castle, casting a warm orange glow over the land as Isabella stood by the window of her small cottage, watching the last light of day slip into twilight. The quiet peace of her life felt surreal after everything she had left behind: her title, her family, and most of all, her marriage. The decision to walk away from Alistair, to leave behind the life she had known, had been a monumental one. It had been the hardest choice she had ever made, but in the months that had followed she had found something she never thought possible: freedom. She had never known what it meant to truly be herself. She had lived her life according to the expectations of others, a woman of duty, a pawn in the game of politics and power. But here in this small, quiet village she had found the woman she was meant to be. The days were simpler, the work fulfilling in its honesty. She had no title, no political alliances, no grand legacy to uphold. She was free, and yet despite the peace she had found, something lingered at the edges of her heart. A question that had been unanswered, a feeling that wouldn't go away. Could she truly let go of everything she had once known? Could she live without the world she had once been a part of, the world that Alistair had been a central part of? The man she had walked away from was still the Duke of Ravensford. He was still powerful, still someone who could shape the fate of the kingdom. The pull of that world had always been strong, and it lingered in her mind, a whisper of something that might have been her destiny if only she had chosen differently. It was late in the evening when the knock came. Isabella wasn't expecting anyone, and the sound of the heavy wood against the door startled her. She stood still for a moment, wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her. It had been months since she left Ravensford, months since she had walked away from Alistair, and she had not heard from him since. When she opened the door, the sight of him nearly stopped her heart. Alistair stood before her, a figure of authority but also one that seemed lost. His once pristine appearance was now rougher around the edges, as if time had taken its toll. His dark hair was longer, his usually impeccable suit now slightly worn, and his eyes, those deep, familiar eyes, held a vulnerability she had never seen before. They were wide with something: regret, longing, perhaps even desperation. "Isabella," he said, his voice raw, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for far too long. "Can we talk?" Her breath caught in her throat. She had thought about this moment many times, but now that it was here she didn't know what to say. She had imagined confronting him, imagining all the words she might say: anger, resentment, sorrow, but now, standing in front of him, all she could do was stare. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm that raged inside her. "I came to apologize," he said quietly. "I came to ask for your forgiveness. I know I hurt you, I know I pushed you away when I should have been holding on, but I'm not asking for forgiveness just for the past. I want to make things right, if you'll let me." Isabella's heart wavered at his words, but her mind remained clear. She had walked away for a reason. She had made the hardest decision of her life, and she wasn't sure if she could go back to that world, the world where she had been a mere asset in his grand game of power and politics, the world that had never truly seen her. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why come to me now, after everything?" Alistair swallowed hard, looking down at his feet for a moment before meeting her gaze again. "Because I've realized something," he said, his voice filled with raw honesty. "I've spent my whole life focused on power, on control. I thought I could control everything, that love was something I didn't need, but I was wrong. The one thing I never knew how to control was you, and now I've lost you, and I'll do anything to make that right." Isabella felt a knot form in her throat. The Duke of Ravensford, the man who had once been untouchable, the man who had always been so cold and distant, was now standing before her, vulnerable. She could see the regret in his eyes, she could hear it in his voice, and for a brief moment she remembered the man she had once believed in, the man who had held the promise of something more. But was that enough now? Isabella stepped back from the door, motioning for Alistair to enter. As he did, she couldn't help but notice how different he seemed. Gone was the aloof, controlling figure who had once ruled the Duke's estate with an iron fist. In his place stood a man who seemed lost, who seemed as though he had been humbled by the passage of time. They sat down in her modest living room, a space far removed from the opulence of Ravensford Castle. The contrast was striking. This was a life of simplicity, where decisions were made for survival, not for legacy. "Alistair," Isabella began, her voice shaking slightly, "you didn't just lose me when I walked away, you lost yourself. You chose power over love, and I can't be a part of that world anymore. I can't go back to being a pawn in your game." Alistair looked pained, his eyes searching hers. "I know I made mistakes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you have to understand, I didn't know any other way. I was raised to lead, to control. I thought that was all that mattered. But now I see what I lost. I see that I was wrong." Isabella closed her eyes, trying to steady her thoughts. She could feel the weight of his words, could feel the pull of the life she had left behind. She had walked away from everything: her title, her family, the Duke. She had chosen freedom, but now, standing here, she realized how much that freedom had cost her. It was a price she had willingly paid, but was it worth it? "You think you can just walk back into my life and undo everything?" she asked softly. "You think I can simply forget the way you treated me, the way you used me to secure your position? You took everything from me, Alistair, everything." His voice trembled as he reached out, his hand resting on the arm of the chair beside her. "Isabella, I don't expect you to forgive me, I don't even expect you to want me. But please know that I would do anything to change the past. I can't change what I did, but I can change what comes next." Silence between them grew thick, as both of them faced the enormity of the decision that lay ahead. Alistair had chosen power. He had always chosen power. And now with the woman he had once thought he could control standing before him, he was offering her a chance to choose him, though he knew it might be too late. Isabella's heart twisted. She had always known that love and power couldn't coexist. In the world Alistair had created, there was no room for vulnerability, no room for true connection. She had lived her entire life beneath the weight of expectations, and while she had left all of that behind, she couldn't ignore the pull of his words. Could she forgive him? Could she trust him again? Alistair's words echoed in her mind as she walked out to the small garden behind the cottage. The evening sky was painted with the last colors of sunset, the fading light reflecting her inner turmoil. Alistair had come to her, asking for her forgiveness, asking for a second chance. And in the silence of the garden, with the flowers swaying gently in the evening breeze, Isabella realized that she had to make a choice: freedom, power, love. She had tasted freedom, true freedom, for the first time in her life. But could she live without love? Could she be content with a life of independence, of solitude forever? Isabella had spent her life seeking approval, seeking a place in the world that was defined by the choices of others. She had walked away from Alistair not just because he had used her, but because she had finally seen that she could live for herself, not for anyone else. But now, standing at the crossroads of the past and the future, she wondered, could she walk away from love for good? Could she deny the pull she still felt for the man who had once been her whole world? And what of Alistair? Could he truly change? Could he truly choose love over power? Was it too late for him to be the man she needed him to be? Isabella returned to the cottage, her heart heavy with the weight of her choice. She found Alistair standing in the doorway, his back to her as he looked out at the horizon. His presence filled the room, yet there was a distance between them that had never been there before. Isabella, he said without turning, his voice raw. I understand if you don't want me, but I need you to know that I'm not asking you to come back for me. I'm asking you to come back for you, for the life you deserve. For a moment she simply stood there, her gaze fixed on him. Could she give him the power to hurt her again? Could she trust him after everything? Then slowly Isabella crossed the room, standing before him. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder, and when he turned to face her, their eyes met. Not coming back to the life I walked away from, she said softly, her voice steady. But I can't deny what we shared. I can't deny that I still care for you, Alistair. I always will. But love is a choice, and right now the choice I need to make is for myself. Alistair nodded, his eyes brimming with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. I understand, he whispered. The silence between them spoke volumes. There would be no easy answers, no perfect resolution. But as Isabella stepped back from him, she realized that this was her choice, her freedom. She would choose her own path, whether it led her back to him or not. And that, she realized, was the truest form of love, the choice to choose herself. If you like this and still want to be listening to such interesting royal stories on the channel, Dark Royal Stories, don't forget to like, share, comment, and most immediately subscribe to my channel, and click the bell for more update.